Hi, I'm Beth Comstock. Thanks for joining here at our Changemakers book club with Charles Duhigg, author and reporter at New York Times. Thanks, Charles, for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm such a huge fan of yours and of GE. This is a real treat
back at
for me.
you. So I'll tell you why we're doing this and sort of set the stage. Change is everywhere. We all are struggling with it. We're all facing it. It's faster. It's more complex. So we set up this book club as a way to bring thought leaders in, share some perspectives. And I think habit really is such a critical part of change.
Absolutely.
Changing bad habits for good. It doesn't mean it's easy. Why is it so hard to change our habits?
It's a great question. And I think part of it is, and if nothing else, this makes it hopefully okay to understand that it's, to accept that it's hard. Habits are fundamental to how we have evolved, right? Every animal that's been successful in evolution has a part of its brain known as the basal ganglia that basically exists to create habits. And habits are what allow us to decide to eat a banana and ignore a rock without having to think about it too hard, to drive from home to work without having to remember the route each time.
It's kind of scary, right?
It is scary, right?
Yeah.
And about 40 to 45% of what we do every day is actually a habit. But our brain can't distinguish between good habits and bad habits. It just latches on to a pattern that seems to deliver a reward. And so that makes it hard because that means that a lot of what we do at work and at home and with our kids, we're not really thinking about it.
Yeah. So I'm inviting people to comment, to send us questions. We've gotten some questions in advance, so I know you're happy to talk about anything, right?
Absolutely.
So we're going to talk about Focus on Changing Habits, Charles' book that was published in 2012. So it's a classic. That's why I love this. It's
thank you.
It stands the test of time. And then your newer book, Smarter, Faster, Better, which is about productivity and really, I think, kind of a continuation of habit.
Absolutely.
Habit forming, I believe.
Absolutely.
So you had a quote. I'm gonna read one of your quotes just to sort of talk about the book. You sort of end the book with this incredible note of optimism. I mean, right now we're talking about habits. Your brain doesn't know if they're good or bad. You said, quote, "If you believe you can change, if you make it a habit, the change becomes real. This is the real power of habit, the insight that your habits are what you choose them to be. Once that choice occurs and becomes automatic, it's not real, it somehow seems inevitable." So you're talking about free will and willpower, and you make a great case that we aren't our habits, we control our habits. Sometimes when I want some ice cream, it's really hard to think that I control that and it doesn't control me.
No, it's absolutely true. And I think we all struggle with this, right? We all struggle with trying to learn our patterns, trying to rely on our instincts that we've developed in work and in life. And at the same time, to force ourselves to take a step back and say, look, has my instinct stopped serving me? I mean, what's interesting is, I imagine through your career, and tell me if this is wrong, that things that have been strengths are eventually things that have to change, right? Because we see this very frequently through someone's career, that they're very good at one thing, and then they rise to a new level, and suddenly what was a strength becomes a weakness, and they have to rethink how they approach questions or how they act. And that's a really hard transition, but the people who succeed, and I'd be curious your experiences or thoughts on this, the people who succeed are the ones who know how to force themselves to take a break and say, let me think more deeply about the choices I'm making, because I need to make them quickly, I need to make them efficiently, I need to be nimble, but at the same time I need to think when thinking is most hard, because that's the difference between success and just sort of status quo.
That's so powerful what you said, thinking when thinking is most hard, because that is when you have to evaluate it. I think of a micro level, just how you start your day. Am I starting my day doing my easy emails and feeling good that I've gotten, I never get inbox zero, or am I starting my day by doing the big thinking projects? That's one way I've had to change, because it's easy to feel productive and realize you haven't really accomplished
gotten
much.
Anything done.
I'd say a bigger way I've changed is, especially early in my career, I think I felt I had to do it on my own. That to ask for help meant you were somehow weak, or that it looked like you didn't know what you were doing or you couldn't handle it. And so I've learned that actually asking for help is what you want to do faster, because
that's interesting.
You get better results, you get better ideas. And that was a shift that I had to make painfully, because I got feedback from people saying, don't just come in here when it's done, do it, give it to me, bring me in early, I want to help. How about you? What are some things you've had to deal with?
I think that I think that one of the things that I've tried to learn to shift is to ask more questions, and to be accommodating of other people's questions. I think, particularly in journalism, there's an emphasis on speed and there's an emphasis on mastery, and being able to take a step back and say, someone else is asking me a question, I need to take their concern seriously. As a manager, I think one of the big shifts I've made is learning that if someone who reports to me has a concern, even if I don't think it's a concern, I need to take it seriously as a concern. Your worry has to become my worry, regardless of whether I think it's valid or not.
So here you're taking time, really the listening skills. It
Yeah.
sounds like. So asking a question is also good listening, right? I mean, that's some of what you're saying.
I think so, and really hearing what people are saying. And it's interesting because one of the things that we know about creating new habits is that a habit forms when there is a reward, right? That our brain latches onto a behavior. It makes it easier when it delivers a reward to us, and that sometimes we have to give those rewards to ourselves. I'm wondering, when you were developing the habit of asking for help, which can be something that feels unrewarded, right? Because it feels like
it makes you nervous.
It makes you nervous.
Feel
How is this
vulnerable,
person?
it makes you feel
The
weak,
vulnerability.
all those things.
How did you reward yourself to make that behavior easier and more instinctual?
Well, I think for me, getting feedback, one of the things that came, GE's really good on feedback mechanisms, and this was earlier in my career. I was working at GE, and I'd gotten feedback, and so because people were expecting it, there was a bit of a fear about it, and then also I wanted to do well with the people I worked with. I wanted us to work well, so I think that would have been the reward, that we weren't maybe as we weren't as good at the performance as we needed to be.
That's interesting.
But so talk about that. So you talk about you get a cue, and then you get a reward.
That's right. So every habit has three components. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for an automatic behavior to start. The routine itself, which is the behavior, and then finally a reward.
So there's three parts: cue,
routine, reward. And that reward is really important because that's how your brain learns to make this behavior easier for the future. So, for instance, take exercise. Many of us, when we start an exercise routine in the morning, you go for a run, you get home, you're kind of running late, and you jump in the shower, you shower as fast as you can, you get the kids out the door, you rush to your desk, you're kind of anxious. In effect, you're kind of punishing yourself for exercising, and your brain pays attention to that. Your brain says, I don't want to make this easier.
Yeah.
So
we do exercise we hate.
Or we do exercise we hate, or we don't give ourselves a pat on the back. We're sort of stoic. And what we know is that it makes it easier for people to start exercising when, after they exercise, they do something like have a piece of chocolate, or a smoothie, or take a nice long shower, or simply keep track of it on a chart and say, I just ran 3 miles. That's great. I've never done that before.
So you're talking a lot about mindset, and one of the first questions we have from one of the folks who's watching is Flavia Sparacino. Sorry, Flavia, if I'm not pronouncing that right. Flavia asks, what mindset makes us more likely to succeed when we have a new habit? I mean, you're talking about a very optimistic mindset, but what if you're not feeling so good?
So I think part of it is optimism, but part of it is also a gentleness with yourself. Carol Dweck has written about the growth mindset.
Yeah, I'm
and
a huge fan of her work.
And it's fantastic, right? And I think at the core of growth mindset is this forgiveness of yourself to understand that making missteps is a necessary part of success. Right. One of the things that it's really helpful in growth mindset is to think about each of your choices as an experiment. And the thing about experiments, for anyone who's a scientist, is, and you know this, if all of your experiments are successful, you're doing the wrong experiments, right? You go into a laboratory.
You get an easy grade.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're going to a laboratory to do experiments to find out which ones succeed and which ones fail. And the failures teach you as much as the successes. But we have this instinct when we make a mistake, when we fail, to beat up on ourselves and say, I'm so stupid, I should have done better. But a gentleness with yourself where you say, look, it's only a mistake if I don't learn from it. As long as I squeeze some learning from this experience, even though it didn't go as I planned, it's still a lesson that I can learn from, and that it's going to help me succeed.
To be gentle with yourself, it's challenging in companies.
It's enormously
challenging. You have a big part of the book where you talk about yourself and then your organization.
That's right.
And one of the things that's interesting, you talk about the power of groups, that really the best change happens in groups. Talk a little bit about that, and then let's talk about change at work.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we know is
Rexford Widmer, I want to give Rexford credit. He says, what do you think the power of support groups to help individuals create new healthy habits? So
that's a great question, Rexford. I appreciate it. One of the things that we know is that change is easier in a group. And we don't know exactly why, right? There's a lot of research about trying to understand why groups help us help us. And part of it is probably social expectations, that if I tell my friend, let's go on a diet together, I have someone who's keeping me honest. But the other part of it is that very frequently it's easier to believe in something when I see it reflected in other people's eyes, both in positive and negative ways. One of the things that we know about Alcoholics Anonymous, which happens in a group setting, is that very frequently people go to AA and they say, well, look, Jim's been sober for like 10 years, and if Jim can do it, then so can I. But they also say, and Al, he's been sober for 12 years. Al's kind of like a jerk, but if Al can do it, then definitely I can do it too, right? Like it's a negative and positive peer pressure that's really important. And I think that that's why groups are so important, is because we tend to see ourselves in part by how we describe ourselves. We observe ourselves. And seeing the reflection of our behavior in someone else's eyes, that influences how we subconsciously think about ourselves.
But that takes a very self-aware person to do what you're saying.
It does, and it takes a supportive community,
Yeah.
right? It takes a community that says, where people genuinely believe that the other people have their own interests at heart.
So then, why is change at work so hard? Because we're all working with other people, yet you say in your book that you believe even the most dysfunctional company or team or culture can change.
Absolutely.
And yet work is fraught with so much anxiety, and I can change, but you can't, and
there's competition.
It's competition.
And
why? How do you start to think about that, using the best of the group, but then getting the group to adapt?
So some of the most powerful research I've seen has been about psychological safety. And Google actually did a lot of research on this, where they studied how to build the perfect team for about 5 years. And they thought putting the right cast of characters together was most important. But what they learned is it's not about who's on the team, it's about how the team interacts that matters most. And what they found is that the number one habit that good teams have is psychological safety, which means I force everyone to talk, I give everyone a turn at the microphone, and then I ostentatiously listen, which means I repeat your idea back to you.
That's a good
I
one.
make you feel like you have been heard. That if you're in a group where people are genuinely listening to you, they're pushing you to share your ideas, it's hard not to feel like you have some type of support there.
So psychological safety also starts to build trust, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
You have this, you talk about why you wrote the book, and I'd love you to talk about that, but you talk about one of the majors you encountered in the Iraqi war. So tell us that story, and maybe also how you came to write the book.
Sure. So I graduated from Harvard Business School, and I had been an entrepreneur prior to going to business school, and I decided to become a journalist in what was probably like the least well thought out financial decision.
That's like a book in and of itself.
Yeah. I was the lowest paid member of my business school class for like the next 4 years, but luckily some people went into not for profit. So. And so I went to work for the LA Times, and they sent me to Iraq. And I had never been in a war zone before. I'd never been a war correspondent.
And you're like, wait a minute, I just got out of business
That's
school.
exactly right. That's exactly right. And so I went down, and I was assigned to do this story in Kufa, which is about an hour south of Baghdad. It's a city where a major had arrived with the command that he should stop riots from happening. And so he sat down with the mayor of the town, and he said, can you stop the gun runners and the suicide bombers? And the mayor said, I don't have any power over any of that. And so the major said, well, what about taking the food vendors out of the plazas? Can you take the food vendors out of the plazas? The mayor says, sure, I can do that. So a couple of weeks later, a crowd starts forming around the Grand Mosque of Kufa, which is this very important site in Shia Islam. And it starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it looks like a riot's about to break out. And at about 5:30, right when it's reaching that tipping point size, the people at the periphery of the crowd, they start looking around, because it's dinner time, for the kebab sellers that used to be in the plaza. But the mayor had removed them at the major's request. So they kind of all wander home, and the people who are watching at sort of one ring in, they watch these people leaving and assumably think to themselves, "Oh, there must be a better riot going on someplace else. I'll go follow them." And the whole plaza clears out, and there's no riot. And the major had been there for about 9 months, and there hadn't been a riot during that period. And I asked him, "How did you know that removing the food vendors would do this?" And he said, "Look, I didn't know that was going to work, but the army is all about changing habits, right? They're about teaching people to instinctually fire back when they're getting shot at. Or you can email your spouse from a war zone now, so they have to teach you good communication habits, otherwise you get into a fight and you're distracted when you're on patrol." And he said, once you start seeing the world in terms of habits, it's like someone gives you these glasses and everything is different. You start seeing your kids differently, your marriage differently, a group in a plaza differently. And I think that's really powerful, because what it says is, we all are creatures who can change in ways that we don't even anticipate or expect.
You had a great quote from him, and while I'm reading it, just reminding people to send us your quotes. We'll pull in comments for Charles Duhigg. We're talking about changing habits. You had this quote from the Iraqi major. You said in the book, the importance of organizational habits in ensuring that subordinates could make decisions without constantly asking permission. So that sounded so like not military to me. So I want to know about that. And then he goes on to tell you and how the right routine makes it easier to work alongside people he normally couldn't stand.
Right.
So it just seems so human. I mean, you're leading teams, you need to just don't come and ask me everything, and I actually don't like what everybody does. And he was confessing that to you.
Absolutely.
So when you think military, you think discipline, and it's all discipline, but that's not what you're saying here.
It's really, I mean, the military, like every company on earth, wants to be more nimble. They want to be more distributed. And oftentimes we have to work with people that we might have trouble getting along with, that we don't like.
Yeah.
That's actually part of diversity, is finding people who are different from us. But I think the thing is that when you have the habits right, when you have the culture right, when your values are aligned, then you can say, look, I don't necessarily want to have a beer with you, but we can work together really well. We understand each other.
So you're finding some common ground.
That's exactly right.
Karen, I'm so Libby. I can't. First, I have my glasses on because I can't read. Karam Ahataldi, and I'm sorry, Karam. I'm terrible at reading and mentioning names today. So, Karam asks, considering external factors in order to make a change, does it require a real external factor before the change can happen? And what I'm reading from that is, you write about you need a crisis. Do you have to have a crisis? And talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of having a crisis.
You don't have to have a crisis, but a crisis helps, right? I think everyone sort of has experiences in their own life.
Yeah.
And the important thing is to understand that sometimes you can manufacture the sense of a crisis without it actually being there.
So you need some sort of burning platform.
You need a burning platform. You need something that makes you say, look, I gotta change, because change is hard. And sometimes that means that the leader of a company gets on the phone, as Tim Cook does at Apple, and says, we're doing great, but in 18 months we could be bankrupt because everything is changing in Silicon Valley all the time. Sometimes it means that you have a spouse who says to you, you've been overweight your entire life, but I'm worried about you. I'm worried, I feel like this, I'm worried that you're not going to see your grandkids, and this creates a sense of crisis. You need to have a reason to change. And sometimes that reason is as simple as saying, I just can't go on the way that it has been going. But that sense of crisis, that's a real motivating factor.
So I have another question here from Carolina Desmone, and she says, how do you recognize when a habit becomes a rut? So again, companies, teams, we get in ruts, and we want to change, so maybe we recognize we want to change. So when we're doing what you say, but we're kind of just keep doing the same thing the same way.
Thank you, Carolina. Hopefully I'm saying your name right for that question, because it's a great question. How do you know when a habit has become a rut? I think that only by forcing yourself to stop and ask yourself, do we feel like we're doing everything in the best way we can, right? This is why thinking when thinking is hard is so challenging, is because it is always easier to continue the status quo. It is always easier to wake up and do the same thing you did yesterday. It's interesting you mentioned doing emails in the morning versus having deep thoughts. My guess is that there were some small rewards for doing those emails in the morning, right?
I feel like a hero.
You feel like, you're on top
productive.
of everything.
Yeah.
And actually in psychology, we call that the need for cognitive closure, that everyone actually has this need to feel like they're productive.
It's why I do the easy things on my to-do list.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so I think the challenge is setting aside time to force yourself to ask yourself hard questions, which I would imagine you and GE do a lot. How have you institutionalized a review of kind of habits that might not even be clear?
Well, I actually, one of the reasons I wanted to have you here and talk about this is I'm not sure we talk about this in work and culture. I actually think psychology is really hard to bring into the workplace. It's sort of left to HR or the org development folks, but for all of us, I think all of us, our jobs are culture and change. And culture is the psychology, the group psychology of how we get things done. I think a big part of it. And so one of the things we've done at GE is just gravitated to much more ongoing feedback. And so it sort of is in line with what you're saying. I think if you're getting feedback, maybe you're able to detect earlier when you're getting in a rut or when someone sees it as a rut. I don't know. How does that strike
I think
you?
that's exactly right. I think that there's always someone on a team who's willing to be the person who says, there might be a better way. But that's a hard thing to say unless you're encouraging them, unless you have a continuous improvement where people are expected to voice complaints. People are expected to voice criticisms. That takes the social onus off of it and makes it so much easier to do.
Because no one wants to be the negative Nell of the group. And so some things I've seen effective that I've tried to use are just just to say it's okay to tell me or actually to ask, tell me something I don't want to hear.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or to encourage people to give feedback anonymously, ask questions, bubble up questions anonymously, even if you have a small team. Those are some things. And team leaders just stop and saying, here's a chance. I'd love for someone to take a counterpoint view.
Oh,
it's
that's
not even
interesting.
saying that you necessarily agree with that, but almost like if you're in debate club, now I want you, if red team, blue team kind of thinking, now I want you to take the opposite view and let's discuss that.
To reward people for actually challenging you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
so those are a couple of
fascinating.
things I've seen.
That's interesting. And does that get indoctrinated in the culture? Do you find that other people imitate that?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's a fine line. I think most cultures, because we're all moving fast, and everybody wants to already know the answer. They're afraid of the ambiguity. They want to show how smart they are. That it's a bit of it's a habit change to stop and say, "What do you think?
Yeah.
Tell me the opposite of what I just said. Is there something there we should listen to?" I think it just takes habit change to even ask those questions.
I do too, and it takes a real comfort. I think a leader who people are comfortable with enough to say, I trust, when you say that you want to hear bad news, I trust that that's true.
Yeah. And even if it's maybe, when I started this, the first feedback was, they were very light. They were very kind. I'm like, no, I want something really, really bad. And, they nominate the nicest guy in the group to give the feedback. And so then you have to know, like, okay, that's nice, but next time I want you to hit me harder.
Yeah.
So you have, that trust is such a
it's
good
such a huge thing to build.
We've gone to a language here of continue and consider, which is a little less harsh in the sense of continue, like that's really good, that's feedback, which perhaps is maybe helping someone develop a good habit. And consider is you think it through, but maybe there's a way you could be more effective. Those are things, so I've started to notice the language changing here.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's particularly interesting for GE since back in the 80s, you guys famously sort of forced a curve on the company, right? And
we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting because that was celebrated in the 1980s, and I feel like the dark side of that became apparent at companies like Microsoft, for instance, where they similarly moved away from forcing a curve onto the company.
Well, different people have different styles, and so you're trying to, the performance habit is good, right?
Right.
Make your commitments, do what you say you're going to do. Those are habits and discipline you want, but it's also letting people find their own way to do that.
Absolutely. And it's hard. It's hard, right? Because you're trying to help people do peak performance.
So Rob Goleb asks, switching gears, let's go back to being personal. He says, how much of a habit is derived from our parents' behavior growing up? And maybe also reflect you as a father.
Yeah.
How have you thought about the research you've done in
with
parenting?
my kids?
Yeah.
I'd be curious to you as a parent as well. So initially, a lot of our habits are based on our parents because they're usually the primary rewarder in our lives. They are the model from which we learn what is acceptable and what isn't, what should be rewarded and what shouldn't. As you get older, though, you definitely have that influence minimizes as you become an adult. But I think as parents, one of the ways we should think about this is being very deliberate in what we reward and what we don't reward, right? So if a kid makes a mistake, but they are doing the right thing, it's critical that you say, I want you to know, I really appreciate how hard you worked at that. Even though you didn't get the right answer, you worked really great at it. And this gets back to a lot of Carol Dweck's work, that we want to praise the effort rather than the innate quality, that it's important when someone brings home straight A's to say, I'm really proud of how hard you worked in school, rather than I'm really proud of how smart you are. Because being smart is something I can't control. That's not something but how hard I work, that's something I can control. And so rewarding the right things, being deliberate in your rewards, and then rewarding the things that people can control, that's how you grow great kids, I think.
Yeah,
But
that's such a good insight. I feel like for myself with my daughters, I think I thought the discipline part of it was supposed to be the parenting part.
Yeah.
You know, that so it's almost more you go to the negative thing.
And it's so
why
easy.
didn't you do your homework?
Yeah.
Not that's so great you did your homework in this way, or it's really interesting the way you approach that. And I think that's something that I've had to work very deliberately to change.
And it's so hard because it seems like, because you want to coach them to be fantastic, right? You want to coach them to say, no, you made a mistake. Do it differently this way. But that instinct of being supportive as opposed to being critical, particularly for high-performing people, it's a hard one to overcome.
Yeah. Well, your children are still young, but as the mother of a once teenager, I can tell you learn parenting, and I think you learn this in work. You say it in the book. You can't order people to change.
Right.
And I don't know how many times I've seen bosses of teams go like, "No one listens to me. I can't get anyone to change." What advice do you have through the research that you've done?
Really, all you can do is persuade them that change is in their own best interest, and more so importantly, to give them the tools to change. I think when people are making mistakes, sometimes it's because they don't care, right?
Yeah.
They don't agree with you, and that happens in work. But just as frequently, it's someone who literally does not understand how they need to change or doesn't have the tools to change, right? Everyone wants to do well. Everyone wants to be successful. And sometimes it's a matter, instead of saying, do it this way instead of doing it that way, of sitting down and saying, why are you doing it that way? Like, what's the miscommunication? What's the disconnect that's happening here? Help. I want to be a therapist to you instead of an instructor.
Yeah, I hear the word coach comes
Yeah.
to mind. So you're really
Yeah.
talking about help serving as a coach, not a commander.
That's exactly right. And I have like a performance coach I work with, and the thing that I notice most of all is like every time I ask him a question, he refuses to answer it. Instead, what he does is he asks me a question.
Yeah, you're like,
right?
this is it.
Right. This is what I'm paying for.
Yeah.
But the same is true of my book editor.
Yeah.
That he never suggests a solution. He just points out problems.
Yeah.
And that's how, honestly, you become great.
I think the fact that you have a performance coach says a lot. I've always had coaches. I recommend the people I have, and it's really they're helping you change this habit, right? They're giving you the feedback that maybe sometimes you can't ask your colleagues.
Yeah.
Or it's something you're not quite ready to ask their help for,
That's
or they're
exactly
too close
right.
to it.
Or they're too close to it. Or you just want someone who you know is completely in your corner. Like,
So we're going great. We're going to have ask people to submit a few more questions. Are you
Sure.
okay to keep going?
Of
a little
course,
bit
of
here?
course, I'd love to.
So when we're talking about work, you have this great story of Paul O'Neill at the time when he ran Alcoa, and you talk about a phenomenon called the knock-on effect. Talk about that. I think it's a really great, almost parable for how you think about change at work.
Absolutely. So So Paul O'Neill came in as the CEO of Alcoa, one of the largest aluminum companies in the world. And when he came in, everyone expected him to focus on increasing productivity or increasing profits or...
In fact, I think the investors weren't very happy after
Yeah,
his first analyst meeting.
they had no idea who this guy was. They'd never heard of him before, right? He was someone who was kind of this like bureaucrat from Washington, D.C., and then he had run this small paper company. And when Paul O'Neill came in, the first thing he said is, I want to focus on worker safety habits. In fact, that's all I'm going to focus on initially, is improving our worker safety habits. And the reason why is because he believed that worker safety was what's known as a keystone habit. That if you could change behaviors around worker safety, that it would set off this chain reaction, this knock-on effect that would change other aspects of Alcoa's culture as well. And that's exactly what happened. Because at Alcoa, people were kind of set in their ways. There were accidents. They had a pretty good safety record, but accidents still happen. And Paul O'Neill said, I want to get us to 0 accident rate. I don't even want people to get paper cuts in this company. That's so audacious.
Yeah.
That every single time they had a success, every time the injury rate went down, they had a new safety breakthrough, he would say to the entire company, this is amazing. Look at what we've done. People didn't think this was possible, but we have a culture of excellence that allows us to do what people thought was inachievable. And it created this belief, right? This belief that Alcoa could do things that they had never done before, that Alcoa could change in ways that people had never even considered. It's called the science of small wins, that we know that the way that we create change is we find small incremental changes.
And that's hard for big companies or any company. I mean, most companies want to get to scale. Big companies, we dream in scale. The
That's
idea of
absolutely
doing
right.
a small win seems small.
Yeah.
But you're saying you have to do that.
Well, particularly, for a company like GE, I would imagine that the idea of coming up with a division that even would do $50 million in revenues, that's
Small.
nothing, right? That's not.
We like them to be $1 billion.
Yeah, exactly.
But you don't wake up $1 billion.
It's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard to come up with $1 billion idea unless you come up with a bunch of $100 million
Exactly.
ideas, and you learn from that. And I think for companies that find the discipline to say we are going to invest in small incremental successes to find the big success. I mean, GE's been doing that for over 100 years now, right? And that's why they're the company they are, and so many others have risen and fallen. Because it takes patience and it takes discipline and it takes humility to say, let's figure out what's working and let's really invest in it.
Yeah,
and let it grow.
I love that word humility. I mean, these words keep coming up of really sort of self-awareness, trust of your colleagues. The word agency comes to mind, not meaning an agency, but giving people agency. If you're a coach and you want people to have better habits, you're trusting that they're going to do the right thing, and you're giving them freedom to find their way.
That's exactly, and I think taking a step back and saying, I will defer to you on this question, right? I will try and assume your best intentions. One person I was talking to, they said that their policy as a manager is that they always assume when anyone says something to them or asks them a question that they're doing it from the best possible interpretation. Right, because miscommunication happens all the time.
Yeah.
People say things, and everyone walks away and says, "Why did they say that? What's going on? But
they didn't ask.
What's their angle?" Yeah, and they didn't ask, right? But there's something about being a manager, being a leader, that makes you say, "I'm just going to assume that you're doing that for the same reasons I would do it, and I'm going to try and support you in that."
This kind of assume noble intent.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Assume noble intent.
So you wrote this book in 2012.
Yeah.
Any new research or any new insights that have come out that have struck your interest? And then talk a little about Smarter, Faster, Better, because
Sure.
that's been that's your next book.
Absolutely. So the big thing in research that's happened around habit formation is this idea that simply training people in how to recognize their own habits is much more powerful than we even thought it was. There's a woman named Katie Milkman, who's a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, who's done wonderful research about how to get people to recognize their own habits and change their own habits around things like exercise. And that in one experiment that she did, and I hope I'm getting this right, she had people choose an audiobook and only listen to that audiobook when they were exercising. And there was something about that anticipation, about saying, this is how I'm going to reward myself, I'm going to listen to the next chapter, that actually made it even more powerful than it would have otherwise been, because recognizing a habit makes it more powerful. And that's kind of what got me onto Smarter, Faster, Better about productivity, was this question of why are some people so much more successful than others? Why are some people or companies more productive? And the answer, it turns out, is that the most productive people in companies are people who develop what are known as cognitive routines or mental habits that cause them to think more deeply when thinking is hard, right? That they write to-do lists in different ways, where instead of putting all of the easy things on the list, they only have 2 or 3 things. They have stretch goals, and they use the to-do list as a device to force them to prioritize instead of just remember what they ought to do. They do things like they spend more time thinking about how they hope their day will unfold, building mental models, because we know that building a mental model helps you allocate your attention to where it ought to be. They do things like what you were describing of self-reflection of their schedule, to say not just what feels productive, but what is actually productive. Even though it feels great to get through all those emails in the morning, is it the wrong use of time? The more that we can create these habits that force us to think more deeply about the choices we're making, about how we can take control, those are the things that ultimately end up being much, much more important to success.
Yeah, it's interesting.
One
One of the things I've learned working with Jeff Immelt, he teaches this at our Crotonville facility, and he talks about his whole career. He has this process where on Saturdays he'll look at his last week's schedule and his next week's schedule. So he'll look back, did I use my time wisely? What didn't I accomplish? What did? And then he'll adjust his schedule the following week to make sure he's doing things that are important. And that's always given me this one, more flexibility about I have control of my time, but also back to what you're saying, what matters most, and do the important thinking. So that's one example of someone I've tried to emulate and tried to create more discipline around how I even think about how I spend my time.
And it's hard, right? It's hard to take the time to think.
It is hard to take the time to think.
And I think when people say, oh, you should be more contemplative, there's a picture that appears in many people's
Yes,
minds,
like
right, of like taking walks in the park and like letting your mind wander. And that's not actually what contemplation looks like. What contemplation looks like is, it, as you know, it looks like work.
Yeah,
It
it's hard.
means you sit down and you start writing things on a pad, and you're ineloquent, or you're pushing yourself to think through a problem that you'd rather avoid. It feels like work, but that's why it actually succeeds.
Yeah. So in the last few minutes we have, what are you working on these days? What are you excited about?
So I'm writing a column for the New York Times called Adventures in Capitalism that takes readers inside a company where someone is trying to make a decision and walks through why they made the decision they did. The piece I'm working on right now is about how to hopefully address some of the sexual harassment challenges that Silicon Valley is experiencing right now. I did a previous piece about Yoplait and the yogurt wars. But it's this basic question of making decisions in business is really hard, right? It's not like it is in the movies. You know them far better than I do, where you run the numbers and the answer is clear, and are you brave enough to and risk-taking enough? No, they're really hard questions, and they're tough to answer.
And sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's just timing, sometimes you can't get out of the team can't get out of its way. Despite
Absolutely.
their best efforts, they can't change the way they work
Absolutely.
together.
And sometimes you have to make sacrifices that are unfair, but that's what's called for. And so it's about trying to understand, how do companies and people make those hard choices, and what can we learn from them?
So Charles Duhigg, thank you. This has been
Thank
really
you.
fantastic, and I know it has stimulated people's mindset. I'm going to sort of try to summarize a couple of things that you've said, and I'd love you to help wrap us up. But this idea about making time to do really hard work and be thoughtful, to really do hard thinking, not just the easy to-do list. This idea, we had Simon Sinek here a couple of months ago, and this sort of know your why. I hear that a lot in what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's know why you do this. Understand you talked about values and your purpose. You talked about Paul O'Neill setting up, we're going to be about safety, and that they were able to change their habits. And I hear you saying that habits are important, and that we have bad habits that just can easily be good habits. Those are a couple of things I take to heart. What would you like to leave everyone with?
Well, actually, it's something you said I thought was really important, which was this shift to asking for help, and this tie to humility. You had sort of mentioned that this word humility, how powerful it is for you, and I think for all of us, that we tend to romanticize and lionize the individual actor who does great things, but that oftentimes greatness comes from a group. It comes from acknowledging what we're not good at, and it comes from being willing to ask other people's help and being honest with ourselves, and that's really hard.
It's really hard.
That's how we succeed.
But habits are good. We
Habits
need
are
them
great.
in our lives.
Absolutely.
It frees us up to have more imagination and productivity and all kinds of
Absolutely.
things. So Charles, thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
and
Beth.
thank you all. See you next month. Thanks a lot.